We're live.
Hello everyone, it's lovely to see you today. On MHTV today we're going to be talking about so many things. It's actually quite hard to give it a title, but we're going to be talking a lot about hypermania, a lot about psychosis, and a lot about that experience and the experience of writing, which is so important, I think, to lots of people who are either studying nursing or other health professional degrees, but also people who just want to understand a bit more about the human experience that we all share, and that some people have different experiences, and thinking about how we can understand, support and care about each other a bit better. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, a lot in a short time. So we want to hear from you. So before we introduce you to our fantastic guest, who we're very lucky to have, let me hand you over to Dave so that he can tell you how you can join in tonight, because as ever, we want to hear from you. We want to hear what you think. Dave?
Yeah, thanks, Nicky. And hi, everyone. And Nicky, I've got to say, we've had the most number of comments so far before the episode started, just people waving and saying hello. So that's obviously lovely. So Amy obviously is a big draw. So yeah, if you want to get involved tonight, there's a few different ways. One of them is on Twitter. All you have to do is include the hashtag MHTV. If you include that hashtag, we'll be able to see the comments and questions, and we'll try and bring those into the chat tonight. And then the other important way is on the Facebook live chat. Again, if you've got any comments, if you've got any questions, please just type them in, and obviously we'll bring in anything that we can with tonight's conversation. But obviously, Nicky, straight back over to you.
Yeah, and let's get straight into talking to our guest. Amy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, hello. I'm Amy Pollard. I am the director of Mental Health Collective, which is a not-for-profit specialising in the social and collective dimensions of mental health. And I'm also the writer in residence at the Centre for Mental Health, where I'm doing a series of long read pieces across the next 12 months, all about like different aspects of mental health. I'm trying to write it kind of like The Sopranos, where each one has its own little arc, but then there's a mega arc stretching across the whole thing. And I draw on my experience as a social anthropologist. I did my PhD all about like knowledge and power and institutions and all that kind of jazz. And also my experience of being unwell myself. So I was sectioned in 2016 and I have a bipolar diagnosis. So I've like seen all the fun of the fair in terms of services and some of the different challenges that come with that kind of experience in life, really. Yeah, so that's kind of me. But yeah, really pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
No, we saw your writing and loved it. And I think it's a real gift to be able to take that kind of personal perspective and the big ideas and actually put them together in a place that really helps people, and it is really interesting, very readable. So I guess maybe we start by thinking about, your journey into writing, how you went down that road, because presumably you might have become an artist or other things. What was it about writing?
Yeah, well, everyone's an artist, aren't they, in a way? And I felt like quite drawn to writing a lot of the time. And I think it's a really helpful thing, especially like if you're a little bit wizzy, which is my way of talking about hypermania. Like it's a really good thing if other people can't like operate at your speed and you're a bit wizzy-woo, then if you can kind of crystallize the ideas in writing, it's almost like you can build a relationship with yourself and lay the ideas down so that you can layer them up. And I've been taking notes on my experiences of wizziness and depression and like the whole bipolar thing since 2009 I started, I think. Yeah. And so I've got, and I because I'm an anthropologist, I take field notes. So I take it in that spirit of like, okay, let's do participant observation, well, I'm participating and observing. And it's almost like a bit like a mindfulness thing in a way, like you kind of externalize the thoughts and try and capture the thoughts as you go. So I had all these notes and I've been using the writing like as a kind of leveling technique, as it were, like when I was a bit wobbly. And then after having layered them up in various ways, like I felt really drawn to kind of synthesize them. And last year I I started writing a book, and I did write a book, which crystallized my experience in a certain narrative. But then, and I was quite pleased with it, but then when I'd finished it, I decided that I didn't want anyone else to read it, which you might argue is a bit of a strategic error, really, when book writing. But I'd been tweeting about it on my private Twitter, and so a small number of people did know about it. One of whom was Sarah Hughes at the Centre for Mental Health, and so she then invited me to become their writer in residence, and I kind of saw that as kind of like a second chance, really, of like try to write again, but this time like write with the genuine intention that other people are going to read it. And I find that image of like having a roof over your head, like being a resident somewhere, it provides that shelter for me to be writing like much edgier, much bolder, much bigger material than I've kind of worked with before. So I've kind of grabbed the opportunity with both hands to really like put some audacity on the table and like write through some quite big ideas that I've been percolating for a really long time, and I've like trying to summon up the courage to put out there, basically.
Yes, it sounds like writing does a lot of different things for you at once. And I'm impressed as well by the kind of concepts and ideas you tackle. And one of the ones I noticed in the first piece was looking at isolation, that kind of loneliness. I wonder if you could maybe talk to us a little bit more about what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mean, if there's anything that people with mental health difficulties have in common, I would say it's got to be loneliness, right? Like that's something that no matter what the diversity of people's experiences, it's something that people come back to time and again. That feeling of I'm falling apart, I'm feeling alone. And, that's certainly something that I've gone through a lot, and that, comes up for me too. And I was trying to reflect on like, what's that all about? Like, what are the roots of that really? And I started thinking about the Enlightenment, which, is a historical period that happened in the 17th and 18th centuries. A kind of intellectual movement coming out of Europe, which put reason at the heart of society, and basically said, like, for human beings to progress and for society to kind of work in a sort of proper, civilized, functional, modern way, what we need to do is be reasonable and to use our powers of reason and logic and rationality to argue with one another and gradually iterate better and better all the time. And the idea behind that was it was supposed to prevent abuses of power that had been happening previously in the 15th and 16th centuries, particularly of the church. Anyway, I know it seems a bit random to be like stepping back 300 years in that way, to say like, let's look at that context. But I think it's really important in terms of the roots of loneliness and mental health. Yeah. Because when we say mad, we could use that terminology both to talk about mental illness, but also having lost reason. So like we'd talk about an idea as being crazy if you can't trace like what that idea is about, or like what the logic of it is. And I actually think that there's, that's not just like a weird linguistic quirk. Like there is something deeply aligned about mental ill health and non-reason of different kinds. And I think that because the Enlightenment 200 years ago placed reason as like the defining characteristic of mankind, and said like the thing that makes human beings different from animals is our capacity to reason. And so if you've gone down that road as a society, then it follows that if you're non-reasonable, then you're alien, like you're not human anymore. And I think it's that set of cultural values which said human beings and being part of society means being reasonable. It means you can be dealt with. That means that if you're non-reasonable, then people don't know how to deal with you, and that's why you become alien, and it's why you feel alone, essentially. And so I think I found that really liberating, like as a person who's had mental ill health themselves, because frankly, like it's not about you in the same way. If you frame it in that cultural context, it's about people in mainstream culture trying to kind of reinforce their belonging within those norms and values of reason, and like you become the scapegoat which other people are using to sort of shore up that cultural milieu. But it's not really about, if you're being excluded and you're feeling lonely, maybe it's not about you, maybe it's about other people and their insecurities and their need to kind of build a wall around a particular set of values. So that was what I was thinking about with that.
I absolutely see how you went down that road, because it does make sense, does it? And some of the things that bounce out of it are these ideas that it's not just having two things, it's having them in opposition. So blending, there's no equal valuing, because we know, like creativity, things that don't make sense but make sense to your heart, they don't make sense to your heart, they're really important to being a human being. But when you divide them up and you have like masculine, feminine, you have reason, non-reason, and you have this separation, all of a sudden you get a lot of values that are privileged over the other set, and it splits people in half.
Definitely. I think that's so right. And it's I'm not anti-reason at all. But I think, as it say, it's about making sure that your head and your heart and your soul and your guts, that they all have a place, and as you say, like having people there holistically. And I think you can even see it actually in the way that we frame mental health as mental health, and you're literally cutting people down to their brains and saying like this is your sort of definition, which I think really does convey a lot about where people's orientation is towards this arena, and the privileging of the mental thought intellectual process over and above the other ways that we could configure ourselves as human beings.
In caregiving, if you think about how therapists are considered when they operate with the higher thought, and people who take people to the toilet are treated, when the human beings need both of those services, and you're a terrible caregiver if you can't tell someone's having a heart attack. You're going to get a pretty bad outcome. So this idea, in kind of certain traditional types of healing and care, and even up until sort of the 18th century, we had a much more holistic view. And now, kind of holistic care, and we talk about creativity as part of well-being, it feels quite new again because of the kind of real biomedical, physical pressures that have been on services for such a long time. And I think if you don't realize where that stuff comes from, go along with it without thinking, you just get taught the thing that you were taught, or believe the thing that society surrounds you with, and never.
No, I think that's right. And I think there's so much more honor in those caring, holistic, bigger, whole person things that people can bring to the table. As you say, like they are incredibly devalued, and there's this weird pedestal of like intellectual brainiac stuff, which just, I don't know. I think it tastes quite sour in the mouth sometimes, and it just comes across as sort of snobbery and people looking down on one another, and missing the much more powerful aspects of life and relationships, and
if you just look over the last 100 years, if you have an intellectual concept without compassion, never ends well.
It's true. It's true.
How does this feed into sort of stigma then? Because you've talked about the idea of in-groups and out-groups, and reason and unreason. So where does stigma come into this, do you think?
Well, I mean, stigma is obviously a way of marking people, isn't it, and holding people differently. So stigma is about defining an in-group and an out-group, and one of the things I think is really interesting about stigma is we always talk about it in terms of what characteristics are different about the person who's out, the person who's stigmatized, and weirdly that's kind of more stigmatizing. Like the opposite maneuver that you could use is to look at, like, what is it about ourselves that we're looking to cast out and like project onto the other person. So so what's the bit that we're afraid of in us that we're then using externalizing, basically putting on a scapegoat, putting on the person who's stigmatized, and then if they like basically carry it away, then it purifies the in-group, and the in-group can feel really safe. So I definitely think that there's a bit of kind of reflective self-scrutiny, and maybe a bit of pride actually for people who, for those of us who do get stigmatized in various ways. Like, there is a position you can hold that in, which allows that to be information about society rather than only something that's like about you.
It's such a everyone will have had some experience of being stigmatized in some way, won't they? And I think it's that you can draw on to try and understand the experience of other people as well. But it's an interesting one, isn't it? That even the experience of loneliness, even saying that you're lonely, is really stigmatizing. People, they absolutely point at the individual. If someone says, I feel lonely, then what is it about you that's wrong? Instead of thinking, actually, why doesn't society connect us better as people? It's really, I think you put the idea that you look back at the people who are in the big group and figure out what they're doing is much more valuable than trying to figure out what these lone wolves have done to get cast out. It's not about them in a weird kind of way. You're absolutely right. It's about what society needs to believe about itself. And
how people challenge that. I mean, I suppose it was back in Neolithic times, it was like the ultimate punishment, wasn't it, to force someone into exile, like into away from the tribe and out of, in ancient Rome, like going out of the city was basically equivalent to certain death, wasn't it? And human beings are such socially dependent animals. But it does obviously therefore mean that for someone who's very unwell, like the absolute worst thing you can then do is to help them, to make them feel exiled and to be putting them in that dynamic. And that's why I think that it's such a precious gift if people who are caring for those who are very unwell can find other ways of relating and be more imaginative, more creative, bigger, wholer, just bring more humanity to the table, so that you're diffusing some of that, because it's totally transcendable. I think that you can connect with people who aren't like, maybe you can't make sense of what they're going through, but that doesn't need to matter. It really doesn't.
It's interesting. There's loads of different circumstances where we connect to people who don't have reason as their primary communication. So if you are talking to somebody who has had too much to drink, if you are talking to an older person with dementia, if you are talking to a pre-verbal baby or something like that, you communicate without even thinking. Connect, you use emotion, you use experience. But there's something, I think, about the experience of loss of control for adults, which is very, very frightening for a lot of people. And instead of reaching out, I think fear makes us shrink away sometimes.
Yeah. Why do you think it's so frightening?
I think people want an illusion of control, don't they? They want the illusion that you can be in charge of your own destiny all the time, and sometimes you can't. Well, the fear of standing out or being different is really extreme. Today's society, we've got such a surveillance culture without meaning to. Everything on Facebook right now, but everything you can say is held up as a standard, as a measurement, isn't it? I think too different. It's too challenging, scary.
Yeah, I think that's right about that wanting the illusion of being in control. I've been reflecting on psychosis a lot recently and thinking about it. Like, to what extent can you use techniques from dream analysis and bring those to making sense of psychosis? Because I think, in my experience, like, often psychosis comes up when you haven't slept for a really long time, right? So to my mind, like it kind of makes sense if you don't sleep and you don't sleep and you don't sleep, like eventually you're going to be dreaming, and like, or like the stuff that comes through when you're dreaming, like will kind of come through anyway, and get in a muddle with like your conscious and your unconscious life. And like we're not in control when we're dreaming, right? Like that sort of comes from a part of you that you're not like in control of. And then by the same token, like what comes up in psychosis isn't really something that you're in control of. But it's almost like that process of sort of ego dissolution, isn't it? Like ego with a capital E, of sort of not having part of yourself emerge, which isn't in that conscious control, but is definitely like part of your inner world, like part of your inner life. And that's so, that's another thing that I think is really fascinating to me, that if you have everything bounded within the thresholds of like, this is a dream, this is awake, then it's all good. But if you lose that threshold and that boundary, and then the like subconscious and the conscious are sort of intermingling together and it gets in a mess, then that's like much harder to ride those waves, and people are much less accustomed to working with that, I think.
And I think it as well, people don't think about, homeostasis is such a fragile, tiny boundary. If you get hot or too cold, you'll see or hear things that other people don't hear. If you spend a long time in isolation, you'll probably see that other people don't hear. If you are without food or water, you will have these experiences. And some people actually go to create them, and I think one of the things that's really interesting with sort of the psychedelic therapists that are coming back again, very interestingly, I wouldn't want to be doing the research ethics on those, but actually I had a talk on that from I think it was Harry Summers, I think, and it's a really interesting one because he was talking a lot about exactly what you say about ego dissolution. So people have had experiences of real trauma, or who have life-limiting illnesses, will often put themselves forward for this type of work. And actually, when you realize you're not the center of the world, it's actually quite freeing in a weird way.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because so often you hear stories of children who experienced trauma, experienced abuse when they were small, like saying that they felt responsible for it, responsible for what happened. And as a child, that was self-protective, because it was better to assume some degree of control rather than admit to the terrifying reality that they were that vulnerable and that much in the hands of the adults who were failing to look after them. And so it would make sense that an ego dissolution therapy that like took away that sense of being having to be in control would sort of work with the grain of that sort of underlying pain, I would say. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that people find hardest is losing control. And maybe ultimately, again, that's to do with what human beings are afraid of, like as in death.
Vulnerability.
Like, those really big questions, and like some of the reasons that people with severe mental health difficulties get stigmatized is because like they're a reminder of like some cold, hard truths about mortality that everyone has to face up to in the end.
Well, they're a reminder of shifting vulnerability, aren't they? When you go on safeguarding courses, you have to teach safeguarding. One of the questions is, us asked, right, who is vulnerable? And the fact is, we all are in different circumstances at different times, different places, but surrounded by different people. We can all be the victim. And it's a frightening thought for some people, particularly if they've spent their whole life thinking, if I don't go out at night, or if I don't do this, or then I'll be safe. When the fact what makes you at risk is being around someone who's predatory and aggressive. It's not. And it's such a hard thing
definitely.
to get our heads around sometimes.
It is. And it's interesting, I think, how we can label ourselves in different ways, can't we? Both in terms of our sort of personal characteristics or our social role or whatever it might be. But you can become sort of blasé or a bit tick boxy about who's vulnerable and who's not, and who has the power and who doesn't. I think it's always worth sort of checking in with the actual reality of that and how that might change according to circumstances, and like which bits of that are within your gift to command and which are not. Definitely like not an area to be too lackadaisical about.
Yeah, I could say I've had some very good conversations about power, and also at some point we'll to come on to your experience of wizziness and what that means for you. But some questions have come in. I just wondered if Dave wanted to just come in a little bit, because I feel I want to again.
It's okay. You know, I never mind, Nicky. I'm always kind of sort of head down on social media, but also trying to follow the conversation. So we've had one question come in from Adrian, and he said, really interesting topic. The hierarchy of medicine and terminology is fascinating. I think that whilst we are hardwired to care, unfortunately, the suspicion on those different is equally as strong. My fear is that people still personalise empathy to make us feel better. What do you think is the most important thing to allow us to care, support and guide with humanity, either spiritually or academically?
One for you there, Amy.
Oh, you know, it's a bit cliche, but I definitely think that you know, being able to care for yourself and check in with your own emotional state is an absolute precondition for being able to empathize and like extend yourself across the barrier with somebody else. And I think that the more accepting we're able to be of whatever feelings are coming up, the better, the more human we are, like stepping into the room and stepping into the interaction. And I think, you know, fundamentally for me, it's about having greater imagination, greater creativity, not getting stuck if we feel like we don't understand where someone else is coming from. Like, don't let lack of understanding be the end of the road when it comes to empathy. Like, go as far as you can with your understanding and then go further to reach out to people in whatever way that they can. And there's always something that you can reinforce when you're engaging with someone. Like, it might be something just as simple as their breathing, or like, you know, a gentle movement that they're doing, but there's always something that you can mirror back that's positive and that's not going to take someone in the wrong direction. There's always some, like, look for the humanity, like take a yes and approach, find one thing that you can say yes to in what they're offering you in that interaction, reinforce that, and then mirror it back in a slightly magnified way, and so that you're able to create some kind of interchange.
Is it possible that you could talk a little bit about what you mean by whizziness?
Yeah, so whizziness is my word for hypermania. So like the psychiatric term is hypermania, like as part of a bipolar experience. Personally, I think whizziness is more evocative of like what this is actually like. Like, there's a speed to it. Basically, you're whizzing, and you've got more ideas and more observations, and you're just operating at a higher speed than people do normally, like in conversation or in social life. And I think, to me, it's a bit like, you know how when you're watching watching a film, and usually like you just watch the different images and everything just looks like in fluid motion. Like, when you're whizzy, when you get really whizzy, it's like your vision becomes so fast that you can kind of see the separate frames, like see the separate images. And so it kind of, instead of social life looking kind of smooth and fluid and you being able to kind of read it easily, everything becomes a bit too obvious. And so you kind of see the social cues that people are giving to asking you to like advance or retreat, like, you know, giving a bid for attention or giving a kind of go away please signal. But because it's all, you're seeing everything too quickly, those become like really blindingly, screamingly obvious, and all the kind of subconscious communication that usually makes social interaction go smoothly, it's not subconscious anymore, it's too like in your face, and that makes interactions feel kind of weird and uncanny, and that's just gets very confusing. So yeah,
like too much definition then, is that what it's like?
Yeah, I think it's too much data, basically. I think when people get too much data, too much multisensory data from the world, it becomes very difficult to interpret. And the usual ways that we would interpret the kind of bids for attention, like the kind of go away signals, like the advance and retreat signals that make up social interaction.
Yeah.
When there's too much of that to make sense of, I think that's where these ideas about like people can read my mind, or I'm reading someone else's mind, or I'm controlling this, or someone's spying on me, like those kinds of like paranoid delusion type stuff. I think that's what comes up when whizziness and this like magnified acceleration of perception like gets misinterpreted, basically. I think those misinterpretations do have like they're not accurate, but I can see where they're coming from. I can see that there's a reasonable guess at making sense of some very challenging data, is what I reckon.
Especially when it's coming at you really fast. How does it make
exactly, and it's really lonely as well, because if you've got all this like material getting thrown at you, and it's all coming to you, it's all too much and too fast, and you're struggling to interpret that data, that probably you're behaving in a way that's making other people may well like feel slightly anxious being around you, and so and that means that if they're feeling slightly anxious and that makes you feel alone, then this anxiety vortex can start where your kind of whizziness makes someone else anxious. Because they're anxious, you feel more lonely, and when you feel lonely, you're more anxious about kind of checking what the hell's going on, and then that kind of it just goes bigger and bigger, and you can't check with them like, oh, I'm feeling a bit confused about the graphics design on Match Today like feels like it's giving me a like secret message. Is that correct or not? Like you can't say that without making people feel really like
alarm.
Yeah, exactly. So you end up kind of sitting either freaking people out or kind of sitting alone in that headspace. And so yeah, from a sort of carer's perspective and professional's perspective, what I think you really need to do is decelerate that anxiety vortex, like be as calm, be as like accepting, just be like, yeah, whiz, you can whiz, it's fine. It's not, I'm fine, you're fine, everyone's fine. Because I think tacitly, the whizzy person is usually asking either the carer or the professional, like, am I out of control? And if the carer or the professional responds in a way that conveys like, oh, I don't know, maybe you are, then that makes everybody panic and makes things a lot worse. But if the carer or the professional can respond in a way that says, yeah, maybe you are, and it's like, yeah, we are losing control here, and we know how to lose control, and we can swim in this water, we can surf on this water, and that's all right. Like, I think if you can convey that confidence and convey that people are accompanied in this process, and that you're not having to deal with it all alone, and we've sailed these seas many times, we know these roads, it's fine, then I think that's the way to decelerate the anxiety vortex and to like help people feel more grounded.
So it really reminds me of like the tidal model from back in the day as well.
What do you mean?
The use of understanding about water and connection and pace and stillness, that stuff, and then the imagery was something, when I was a baby nurse, I found it just so helpful. So I'd come from like a history and English background, and it just made sense to me. Like, of course people want to feel safe. Of course, why wouldn't they want that? That's what everybody wants.
Yeah.
And I can hear we've had some more questions come in, so let's go back to Dave. It's going to be thick and fast. We don't want to run out before the end. This always happens. It's quiet at the start, and then as soon as we start thinking about we've been on half an hour, it gets busy.
Yes. Now Rory's done a one sentence question, which I love, as in, it's short. I love short questions. Should antipsychotic medication be an over-the-counter drug, non-prescribed?
Ooh. I mean, I'm in no position to make a call on something like that. My instinct is like, probably not. That doesn't sound like a very good idea. just on the face of it, they're quite strong, powerful things, aren't they? But I mean, if you, my experience of psychiatric medication in general is that, some of it's pretty horrible and you have really horrible side effects with it, but you can kind of learn it. Like, I know how certain drugs feel in my body now, in the same way as I know how a glass of wine will feel. And I have a relationship with my psychiatrist, which means that I can like cut up my pills into like the smallest, like tiniest fragments, and therefore like take a tiny sliver at like the absolute earliest little sign, and like I've got a lot of attunement to different symptoms, and so I can take a tiny weeny bit and then I don't get any side effects to speak of. You can just sort of ride it. And I think that basically if you can do your best to build trust with the professionals who hold the keys to the medicine cabinet, and if they can trust you, and you can get to a point where you're taking exactly what you want to take, and exactly what the benefits, the costs and benefits are going to be. But I think sort of familiarity with your own symptoms and then learning of the medication can definitely like get you a long way. Is my experience. But yeah, let's not like just have a free for all. That would be my.
I don't think they're just going to just change it because you said Amy. Don't worry, it's not on you.
Yeah, what power you have, Amy.
Yeah.
So I've got to say that I think a few other people on the Facebook chat agreed with your comments, Amy. So that I think you're on the side of the majority there. Okay. Now, Florence has asked a question about how do we create awareness on stigmatization in some cultural communities.
I think you have to be a bit more specific about some cultural communities, don't you? Obviously, different communities are different, and the approach that you would take in each particular like cultural background would be like distinctive. Obviously, like working from first principles, the first thing to do is to like have some deep, real understanding about what the context is and what the background, what's the background of the concerns, like where does this sit, within people's beliefs and norms and values and prior experiences and all of that stuff. You'd want to be having a very sort of deep co-productive, led by the right people from those communities as much as possible, etc. And having like whatever can be done to build trust and dialogue and all the rest of it. I think the reality is that cultural change is always is slow and painstaking, and it's a lot easier to destroy trust than it is to build it. So I think you don't sort of wave magic wands around and have like one-off interventions. You have to build trust over a long period, and first thing to really stop doing all the awful things that have been done, and obviously the horrors that have been wrought on the Black and Afro-Caribbean communities is sort of is the number one thing. Like stop doing all those, Black people being 4 times more likely to be sectioned than white communities. The levels of drugs being so much more severely medicated, much more likely to have enforced constraint, all that stuff. Stop doing all that, and then we can start the trust building part.
And I suppose it goes back to that first principles of healthcare, isn't it? The first thing should be do no harm. And I think as you've described there, actually, there's plenty of experiences and examples where we do harm. And, the first principle should be, we'll stop doing that.
Yeah.
I think
it's not weird to be frightened of something that's frightening, is it?
No.
The other thing, I suppose, is how that fits in with your series of blogs that you're doing for Centre for Mental Health and that kind of attempt that you're making to get that information out there in an understandable way. So I suppose that's one of the planks as well, isn't it, about how do we educate people? Well, it's having easily accessible, helpful information like the stuff that you're producing.
Yeah, I'm sort of doing my best with it. it is my work's quite it's quite ambitious in some ways, and it's not the sort of snackable content that you can just enjoy your cat gifts during your lunch hour. Like, it does ask a little bit of attention, like, from the readers. But there's audio versions of all of my pieces and print friendly versions as well. And I've put in as much I've lightened it as much as you can possibly do when you're talking about severe mental illness. But yeah, I do think that there's a lot of interesting and honourable and really exciting material that comes out of the experience of severe mental illness, which is relevant and pertinent and kind of weirdly at the cutting edge of society more broadly, which it's a real privilege to be able to come through from the margins and offer that different perspective. So I don't know, I'm kind of I'm excited by the opportunity to try and bridge those gaps, and to try and to kind of see where you can go by taking these very difficult experiences and seeing what they can offer to mainstream society, as well as improving mental health practice.
It seems like we're running out of time a little bit now. It's gone so fast. I really haven't.
Yeah.
We've certainly covered some ground, which we made a list at the start of things we want to talk about, and we've pretty much covered it. So that's pretty good. And I know that there's some comments on Facebook and probably on Twitter as well that we haven't got round to yet. So if you have contributed tonight and we haven't got round to you, thank you. It is really appreciated, and we will go and have a look and get back to people as soon as we can do that. But I guess maybe we think about any kind of last thoughts you want to leave people with, any messages, or maybe even tell people what's coming up if it's not too much of a spoiler, Amy.
Oh, yeah. So my next piece, which is coming out in the new year, is going to be all about the attitudes that we need for navigation. So if it's true that the mystic swims in the same waters that the psychotic drowns in, then what does it take to swim? What are the attitudes that you need in order to swim in those very challenging, psychic weird waters? So yeah, so that's what's coming up next.
I'm actually quite looking forward to that already. I was thinking, that sounds good. David, is there anything you wanted to add to that? You can shake your head if there isn't. Oh, cool. Right, in that case, it's just send me through a little link to remind everyone that next week, if it's not enough that we swam in some serious waters today, we're doing social justice next week in 40 minutes.
Yay.
Get into the position, guys. Get ready. And we've got Lucy Colwell and Warren Stewart with us talking about social justice and mental health. So again, just thank you so much to our fantastic guest. If you have not been reading her writing, get yourself sorted out. It's there for you. And lovely evening to everybody. It's been good to have you on board. Take care and have a good night. Night, guys.
Bye.
See you next week.
Bye.